All right. My name is Annie Hughes. For those of you who don't know who I am, I've been coaching on the Sharman Ultra team for a little over a couple of years now. And I run professionally myself, but the coaching has just been such a great way to connect with people in the sport and help people achieve their goals. It's just been so rewarding for me. Um, yeah, I'm here to answer some of your questions this evening. And I have some that were sent ahead of time, but if you are watching this live and you have some questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and I will answer those as well. Okay, I'm just going to get right into it. The first question is, how can I improve mental toughness to cope better with things going wrong in races? And mental toughness is such an important part of ultra running. Like if it were left to just a physical feat, um, yeah, our bodies would tell us to stop probably well beyond before a marathon. So, yeah, it's really left once our body starts shutting down and saying, you know, okay, I think I've had enough. It's our mind that tells it to keep going. So, I could talk a lot about mental toughness, but I want to talk about it in the context of things going wrong in races. And I think the first thing to note is that, you know, when you show up to a 100-mile start line, it's a pretty daunting thing, and you just don't really know exactly what's going to happen. I think that's one of the cool things about the sport is just things are going to happen that you weren't expecting. And it's just how you react to those things that is the difference between maybe finishing or not. And I think the biggest thing with this is not getting attached to a certain outcome. So if you have a pretty lofty goal, like to win the race or to, set a PR, that's a pretty lofty time. um, and, something happens, like your stomach goes south or you take a wrong turn and a bunch of people pass by the time you get back on course. It's how you react in those moments. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to achieve, the goal that I, set out to do. And then you start reevaluating and problem solving and, yeah, changing up your goal to just finish or just get to the next aid station. Uh, yeah, I would say just gaining experience with these races. Like the more experiences you have, you can draw upon and um, think back, like, okay, I overcame that before, I can do it again. And then just not getting attached to that certain outcome when you realize you're not going to, win the race. Focus on finishing and what you can do in that moment. Okay, the next question is, what are your tips for races in Colorado with higher altitude? Yeah, this is an environmental condition that not many people have access to. And I've coached people, who live in Leadville, which is pretty ideal for altitude training. And then I've also coached people who live in the flatlands and are coming up from sea level to do the Leadville 100. Um, I think the biggest thing is like the most important weapon against altitude is your fitness. So the more fit and prepared you are going into the race, the better you're going to be able to react to those environmental challenges. So if you're showing up, a little undertrained and just finishing it in itself is going to be hard. You're going to have a tougher time when just running 100 miles in itself is going to be a big challenge, plus the added environmental um, conditions. So, the more prepared you are overall, just going into that distance, like the better you're, or the more resilient you're going to be against things like altitude and heat. So, that's number one, just being trained properly and ready to run the distance. And then the other thing is altitude sickness usually kicks in around 24 to 72 hours after arriving at altitude. So you're probably not going to want to, you know, fly out and get there right away to start the race before that 24 hours hits. So ideally, you'd want to get there a week or two before the race just to acclimate a little bit. And also just know that, you know, running at altitude is going to feel a bit different than it does at home. You know, you might feel shortness of breath. You might have some stomach issues um, because of that change in environment. So, um, yeah, just knowing ahead of time, like mentally preparing, okay, it's going to feel a little bit different. And then, you know, showing up uh, really prepared and well trained, and then just really taking care of yourself and pacing yourself well, not going out too hard. You're probably going to blow up a lot more at altitude than you would, you know, at sea level. So pacing and taking care of yourself well, hydrating, eating is going to become much more important if you're not used to that environmental condition. So um, that's what I'd say about that. And then next question is, how do you dial in race nutrition for 100 and 200 milers, especially if stomach issues have frequently been a problem? So yeah, race nutrition is a pretty broad topic, and it really depends on the person and what works for them. But as a rule of thumb, I would say trying to get 60 to 75 grams of carbs per hour, and then 12 to 16 ounces of fluid per hour. So, however works best for you to get that in, gels, chews, um, whatever kind of drink mix you like. Um, but you're going to want to try to meet those grams and ounces of fluid per hour. Um, and I think the best thing to do is just experiment with that in training. So in your long runs, practice with different gels and figure out what works the best. And then I usually encourage athletes to do a training race before their big A race, which is usually, you know, a 100 miler. So usually they'll do a 50 miler leading up to the 100, and we kind of use that as a dress rehearsal for the 100. So practicing, you know, the gels that have worked best for you in training during that 50, and just making sure it all works well. So, um, and you don't even have to do a race before the 100. You could just go out and do like a really big long run and kind of use that as your dress rehearsal. But I think that's a really great way to practice and dial in your nutrition. And then there's another question I have that kind of goes along with this. So I'm going to skip over to that now. But what is the top fueling tips for 200 milers? How much real food versus energy drinks, gels, and any real foods you find work well for lots of runners? So, uh, my rule of thumb is, you know, the more or the longer the race is, the more real the food becomes. So, um, you know, in a 50 miler to 100, you can probably get by with just mostly gels and drink powder, chews, and stuff like that. But going beyond that, you're probably going to want something a little bit more substantial, especially if you're going through the night and it gets cold. You're probably going to want some hot food. So, I usually, some things that I think work well for most people are things like broth, like some really salty broth. And if you can stomach it, having some noodles in there, so some type of ramen is really good. Or mashed potatoes also sits really well. Something that I do personally is mix instant mashed potatoes in with ramen. So it's kind of this like slop, ultra slop that is easy to get down. Just something with a lot of salts and carbohydrates that's easy to get down. Something else I do is instant oatmeal mixed with some cocoa powder or like some hot chocolate mix. So there's some sugar in there, and some coffee. So you get some caffeine, and it's just easy to like toss back and drink. I just find the foods that you have to chew are a little bit harder to get down. So soups and kind of mushy stuff is a lot of times the best thing. So Uh, and then at the aid stations, typical things they'll have is like quesadillas and um, I don't know, even the 200s, they'll have like burgers even or burritos. So if you're training for a 200, I would recommend adding in some of those types of foods into your training. Um, maybe practice stopping, sitting down for a bit and eating like almost a full meal, burrito, piece of pizza, a quesadilla, ramen, and then go back out and finish your long run. And just getting used to like sitting down, eating real food and what that feels like, and then getting out and going for a long ways, I think is a really good way to practice that. Um, all right, I'm going to go into the next question. What are the best types of cross training and how can these be incorporated effectively? So I'm a big believer that the best way to get better at running is by running. So if your body can handle it, I would, you know, focus more on that rather than cross training. And it also depends on like the time of year, like how close you are to an event. If you're further away from an event, I would say doing cross training, a little bit more frequently is good. But it really just depends on your body and what feels best to you. And some people are a little bit more injury prone, and so it's good to supplement with some cross training. And I usually recommend things that are a little bit more comparable to running. So cross country skiing, I think, is great if you have access to that and it's wintertime. Pool running and then biking are the top three that I usually recommend. And those are great because they're, no impact and you can really get your heart rate up high, especially with biking. You can hold a higher heart rate a lot longer than you can running. So that's a great way to build up your VO2 max and just overall fitness without, pounding your body down. So I do think there's a huge benefit to cross training and um, but it just depends on the person. Like some people are really durable and can handle, more running, and that works for them. But yeah, there's definitely a time and place for cross training, and I think it, deserves a spot on the training pie. Is what I think of is like all of your training is a pie, and then you have a percentage of cross training and harder efforts and then endurance work. And I'll talk about that more too during this. So the next question is how can I improve uphill running and hiking plus switch between them? So yeah, it's really important to work on both hiking and running just because they're completely different muscle groups. And so if you're training for a 200 where you're going to be walking a lot, or even 100 where there's a lot of hiking involved, and you're just doing all running training, um, you know, it's not gonna, or you're not gonna be as well prepared for when you have to hike a lot during the race. Um, and yeah, so that's something I definitely like to incorporate into training. And I usually have people do like a long run that's a little bit more runnable, and then a long run that's a bit more of an adventure type of long run with some hiking involved. And that looks different for different people, like depending on where they live. I have a lot of people who live at sea level doing workouts on the treadmill, and I'll break it up and have them do like part of it outside and then the hill work on the treadmill and then go back outside. So it's not just like 4 hours straight on a treadmill. But I usually have them do like interval type work just to make it also a little bit more interesting on the treadmill. So switching between hiking and running and having it at a pretty steep grade, like 20%, and do intervals of like run for a minute, hike for 3 minutes, and do that 10 times, sort of thing. And then I also have them pack their pack like they will for uh, an ultra, a 200, where you have to carry a lot more nutrition, a lot more water, and a lot more gear just because there's more space in between the aid stations. And then you're also moving at a slower pace. than even 100. So there's a lot more time and more things you need to carry with you in between the aid stations. So that's also good to practice. So I have them wear their pack and then also, yeah, go outside and hike with the pack, run a little bit with the pack. Um, so yeah, with the 200s, there's a lot more um, hiking involved with the training. I think fast packing is another really great training strategy for 200s. So that's another thing I encourage people to do if they have time. But um, yeah, it depends on how much time they have, what their schedule is like, if they can even get to a place where they can fast pack. Um, so yeah, and next question is for 200 milers, is it still worth focusing on short races and speed work and the build up? Yeah, so this kind of goes back to that pie I was talking about. Um, I always think like 20% of that pie, it's a good idea to incorporate some speed work. And even for 200 milers, I think it's good to incorporate just to, be a well rounded athlete. And yeah, training and just train all the systems is just going to make you overall a better runner. So I think it still deserves a place in the pie. Not just all endurance work, that's definitely going to be like the majority of it. But I think it's important to do some speed work just to increase overall fitness. Um, so yeah, it's definitely less important than even a 100 miler, but it still is important. And I usually do encourage people to do some tempo type effort, which is like a half marathon race pace effort and like intervals at that type of pace. Um, hill strides are really good for building some speed and strength. So those are some ways you can incorporate it in without it being kind of the wear on you too much with all the volume you're doing as well for a race like that. Um, all right, ahead of doing a new race distance for the first time, how can I prepare for the unknowns? Yeah, so touched on that a little bit with the question about improving mental toughness with things going wrong in races. But it's kind of the fun part about uh, yeah, doing these crazy long races is there's so many unknowns. Um, and I think, you know, the more experience you get, the better, prepared you'll be as far as unknowns. Um, so, pushing yourself to go out and do some training races before your big goal, I think is a great way to kind of feel like you have some experience and kind of know what to expect a little bit. But yeah, I would say the top three things that usually go wrong for people in races is their mental game, their feet, and their stomach. So before my athletes do a race, we kind of go over a plan to address those three main things. Just making sure that they're in, good headspace mentally going into the race, and yeah, making sure that they feel ready to go run 100 miles because it's not an easy thing to do mentally. And yeah, talking through like realistic goals, like okay, if you fall behind and aren't on pace for your goal time, what's the next goal that we're gonna um, work towards? So that's the first thing, and then stomach, coming up with a really strong nutrition plan that you've practiced in training. Um, it might not go perfect on race day, but um, having some backup plans to problem solve for that. Like, okay, if these gels aren't working, let's have like this other gel I've tried in training that works well too. Have that on hand so we can switch over to that if this one doesn't work. Just kind of having a backup plan for everything is good. And for feet, just finding a comfortable pair of shoes that you can wear for 100 miles that you've tested in training. For 200s, I recommend that people I always recommend that people bring an extra pair of shoes to their race. Um, and for 200s, I think it's good to go up a size. So that way, when your feet swell, you'll have a pair of shoes that are a little bit bigger and account for that swelling in your feet. And then I also recommend, I really, this is just a personal preference, but I really like toe socks because it creates a barrier between the toes. So if they're rubbing, they'll rub against the sock before your skin. So that's another good way to prevent blisters. And then just taping your toes um, before the race, like any spots that normally get a little like hot during training, it's good to just tape them before the race, like before it's even a problem. So like for me, I know my pinky toes, like the whole entire toe just turns into a blister, so I know to tape them before the race, and usually I don't have any issues when I do that. And then also using some sort of anti-chafe lube on your feet is also good. So yeah, putting the um, taping your feet, lubing them, good socks, shoes that are comfortable. Also recommend gaiters, and that just prevents, rocks and dust from getting in your shoes. And it might not seem like a lot will get in there, but it can add up and um, also cause problems and blisters on your feet. So um, just all the preventative things. And, in a 200, like the tape will probably wear off at some point and you'll have to replace it. But just starting the race, like with a band-aid on everything is a good idea. Um, so yeah, I would say those are the three things to keep in mind before. And then next question is, I always seem to blow up in races, so how can I get better at pacing? Yeah, so with pacing, I think it's a really good idea to, run at least half the distance before running the full distance. So if you're training for a 100 miler, doing a 50 before, and then you can kind of use the time that you got in the 50 and double it, add a little bit of time, and kind of use that as a way to predict what your 100-mile time will be so you can create a realistic goal. And then based on that goal time, you can figure out what your splits should be um, going into each aid station. And so I like to make a chart of like and write the time that I need to be at each aid station in order to get the goal time. And that just helps me. I at least like to follow it for the first half of the race, just to make sure that I don't go out too hard. And I also encourage my athletes to do this because the pace is going to feel so insanely easy in the beginning, and it's just so easy to go out too fast. So having that chart can really help you um, make sure that you don't go out too hard. It's gonna be like, oh, I'm not supposed to be there for another 15 minutes. I'm a little ahead, so you can slow down a little bit. And that's a good way to control yourself and not get caught up in the competition. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in that before the race really spreads out. So just focusing on your goal and the time that you need to hit to get into the aid station is a really good way to make sure you don't go out too fast and blow up. So ultras are really just a race of who can slow down the least. So um, yeah, definitely important to go out slow. All right, next one is, what did you learn from elite runners since you first entered the sport? Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I learned was, I think, my first 100 miler. I came into an aid station and I just thought everyone sits down and stops at the aid station and takes their time and eats. And I was sitting there and the lady behind me caught me at the aid station. She came in, um, switched her pack, her crew like put her new pack on. She like grabbed something to eat, ate it really quick, and then ran out. And she was in and out within a minute. And I was sitting there just like watching that the whole time. And that's when it kind of dawned on me like, oh, I could save a lot of time if I, yeah, just got through the aid station a little bit quicker. And it's crazy how much time you can save if you're efficient at the aid station. And there's such a balance between like you need to take care of yourself. It's not good to rush through it and, not get everything you need just because you're trying to get through it fast. But also not just like hanging out and, you know, wasting time. So I think having a plan and before every race, I like to, and I encourage my athletes to do this too, is to write out exactly what you need to do at each aid station. Um, and, you'll approximately know, especially if it's 200, like what time of day it'll be. So it's like, I'll probably be coming through here at night. So I'm going to need to pick up, an extra headlamp, some warm clothes, all the things that you're going to need to get through the night. And then also write down like some food that will probably sound good at that time. Like, and it's going to be nighttime and cold, so I'll probably want some salty, warm broth or ramen. Um, and then write out what uh, gels and like nutrition products you're going to need to take with you for the next section. And then put them in little baggies so that your crew sees, okay, we're at this aid station at mile, you know, 120. Here's the baggie for 120, and they just can put it in your pack. And that way you're not sitting there wasting time like, oh, I don't know if I need 2 gels or 3 gels for this section. You can just have it all ready for you there. So I think just having a written plan for your crew, this also makes crewing a lot easier too, um, of what you'll need to pick up at each aid station and drop off, what nutrition you're going to need to take with you, what nutrition you want to eat at the aid station, and if you're going to sleep at that aid station, plan for how much time you're going to sleep, and yeah, that way things just are a lot more efficient because a lot of times, especially in the middle of the night, you might be, you know, sort of brain dead and not really making decisions like quick enough. So it's good to have people who know you, know your plan, and can sort of make those decisions. Like, okay, you're going to need to take a couple extra gels with you because you're slowing down a bit. Like that's something you probably wouldn't think of if it's just you out there. So, um, yeah, just having a solid plan for all of those things and being really efficient at the aid stations. And also, it's great for crew to time how long you're there. And, it can be adjusted if you're having some issue and like you really do need to spend more time at the aid station. Uh, but a lot of times it's um, good to have like a time limit so they can kind of push you out and make sure you don't hang out for too long. So yeah, I would say that's one of the biggest things I learned is aid station efficiency. Um, what are the biggest things you've learned from coaching runners? Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I've learned is, everyone is just so different and things like people adapt to the training really differently. Um, and not one type of training works for everyone. So some people, kind of going back to the cross training thing, some people do really well with a lot of cross training, and some people do better with more running. And also, I always have to remind myself like this isn't their, training isn't their number one priority. So also getting to know the athlete as a person and what they have going on in their life as far as like work and family things. Like I have an athlete who just had a baby, so accounting for like, okay, so he's not going to get a lot of sleep during this time, so we should probably dial back training a little bit, um, just because all of the outside stress from outside of training all comes it's all in the same pot. So if you're super stressed with something at work, um, it doesn't mean that it's not going to affect your training. So I think it's really good to just get to know athletes in what they have going on in their life outside of running, because it does really have an effect on their training. So um, yeah, and just the importance of individualized training and figuring out what works for different people. I think that's the beauty of having a coach is that personalized training instead of just following, some generic marathon plan. Like it's really helpful to talk with someone who knows, what's going on outside of running and then can adapt the training to your schedule. So, yeah. The next question is what is your preferred race distance, both for your own racing and training runners? My personal favorite race distance is the 100 plus milers. And I feel most comfortable coaching runners for that distance just because like that's the distance I have the most experience in. It's kind of my bread and butter. But I love helping runners who have like never run an ultra before and maybe their long-term goal is to run 100 miles or 200 miles and helping them build up to that, I think is really cool. And I've done that with a few different people. And it's just, yeah, really cool to see the progression over, a year or two. And it's totally possible to have never run before and run your first 100 miler within a year. So I think working with people who are building up to those longer distances is really cool. And then my first athlete I ever worked with was actually training for a road marathon, and I've actually never run a road marathon, but that was really fun to coach too because I come from a track and cross country background, so kind of combining what I know about that and then ultra running and figuring out how to create a good road marathon plan was fun too. So yeah, I really like coaching all the distances. I also do some high school cross country and track coaching. So uh, work with kids just getting into running for the first time to adults who are running, 200 miles. So it's pretty cool to work with a wide range like that. Um, yeah, and the next question is if a North American runner has run one or several USA 200 milers, are there things to consider before tackling a European 200, such as Tour de Gens or Swiss Peaks? Would you approach the training differently? Yeah, so there's some pretty big differences between um, running a 200 here in North America and then the 200 milers in Europe. There's just the mountains there are so different, even from like I was training in Colorado, and I just felt like even Hard Rock was sort of flat compared to a European race. So I did have an athlete who this was all within a year. He ran his first 200, the Moab 240, and then after that signed up for Cocodona 250 and finished that, and then the year or yeah, then signed up for Swiss Peaks 360K, which is 230 miles with uh, almost 90,000 feet of gain. So yeah, all within like less than a year, he did all that and didn't finish the Swiss Peaks race, but is planning to do it this coming year and use what he learned from this year's experience. But it was totally different from an American 200 miler, and just the pacing and the ups and downs. Like the ups are just exhausting and take forever because it's so steep, and then the downs are just really beat up your quads and your feet. Just like everything feels like it's gonna break. So um, in the American 200s, there's just like a little bit more running involved, and the hiking is a little bit more tame. But yeah, those European races are no joke. And it's hard to train for them, even in a place like Colorado. So I had that athlete who lives at sea level do a lot of work on the treadmill. So he's just doing a lot of hiking with a heavy running pack on like the steepest grade the treadmill could go, and doing intervals on that. And um, we did a bunch of strength work for his quads because he couldn't really get the downhill stimulus as well. And that's super important for a European race. So making sure you're doing a lot of, um, strengthening exercises for your quads, like lunges, squats, deadlifts. Um, yeah, all that type of stuff is really good. Also, plyometric stuff where you're jumping off of, boxes, landing on one foot. That's all really good for to build quad strength and all the muscles that you need for downhill running. So yeah, those would be the biggest things. It's just like a lot more hiking, a lot more steep hiking, and really strengthening those downhill muscles and kind of beating up your legs. Um, and then if you can, working on a sleep strategy because it's going to take a lot more time than an American 200, just because there is so much climbing, and so you'll probably need to sleep more. Um, and for the front of the pack people, it's going to take them 2 or 3 days to do uh, one of those races, and then for back to pack people, like you are probably gonna be out there for like a week. So that's a big difference between I think the 5 day cutoff for an American 200. So you're just gonna be out there for you know a day or two longer, which makes a big difference. So coming up with an effective sleep strategy uh, is also going to play a big role. Um, I always recommend sleeping, you know, pretty early on. Like, don't wait until you're too out of it um, to sleep, and keep it short but more frequent. So, um, I think 15 minutes is a magic number. If maybe 15 minutes, depending on how long it takes you. But maybe the first night, sleep 15 minutes and then do another 15 in the morning, and then wait until the night to do another 15 minutes. Because it's hard to get going, like the longer you sit and sleep. Yeah, especially if you're sitting down and eating, everything starts locking up. So the quicker and more efficiently you can get through the aid stations, the easier it'll be to kind of warm up again and you know get moving. So yeah, that is all. Those are all the questions that I have that were sent in ahead of time. But if anyone has questions, I will answer those too. Doesn't look like there are any questions in the comments. But thank you all so much for listening. And yeah, I hope I get to work with some of you sometime. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much.